I have been having a ton of fun with this new Barbarian build, and I've been doing a bunch of different testing for various things for survivability and damage output. I wanted to create something that could clear dungeons quick and efficiently without having any Fury problems and improve our single target damage, while still being able to use Whirlwind. Now, the things that I've done in this build to improve all of this can actually be applied to a Hoda or Bleed build as well, and you might have a lot of fun with it, but we are going to be showcasing this with a Whirlwind build because quite frankly, it's my favorite at the moment. I have been messing with a Hoda and Bleed build as well, but I haven't been able to get them to clear as high dungeons as the build I'm using right now. Currently, I've been able to clear up to Nightmare Dungeon 55 at level 81, and quite frankly, it really isn't the level that matters too much with this. It's just better prioritization of stats that has helped me clear higher and higher Nightmare level dungeons. I haven't gotten any glyphs higher than 55 yet, but I do have to say having a pack of mobs run up to you and essentially kill themselves just by touching you, doing anywhere from 20 to 120,000 damage per time they hit you, let alone all the other damage you're going to be doing as well, is a game changer for Barbarian. The second I got this unique chestplate called Razorplate, I knew I wanted to create a Thorns build with Whirlwind. I rolled the worst possible for this chestplate and I still get 7,657 Thorns from it. And as you can see, I've started stacking Thorns in my armor as well, although I don't know if this is necessary, but I've done it and I've been surviving fine. You can do health or damage reduction while stunned if you want. I definitely recommend, if you're playing hardcore, to use the damage reduction while crowd controlled. It'll help you so much. But right now I have Thorns socketed into all my equipment, so I'm currently running 10,395 Thorns. But what's really interesting about this is damage dealt is affected by the skill damage increase from your strength. And this is where Thorns can become incredibly powerful. I could actually get quite a bit more Thorns if I wanted to, and it's going to be up to you if you want to change some things around if you want. Currently I have 1,090 strength, which also gives me an additional 1,090 armor, which is so nice to have. And I've actually changed up a lot of stat allocation. This didn't come from leveling. This massive increase in strength that I have is because I've decided to change up the way I was prioritizing my stats on my weapons. And I have to say, it has drastically changed the way my Barbarian has played. But what's nice is this also really increases the damage output that your Thorns is going to have, as well as all the other damage that you're going to output. There will often be times now where a pack of elites will run into me, start doing damage, and they will just kill themselves without me really having to do anything. The only thing I have to do is actually survive the damage output that they're doing. So having this coupled with high damage from our Whirlwind or Hoda or Rend or whatever you're using can in some cases almost double your damage output, because not only are we going to be doing damage to the monster that hit us, if you use something like this legendary aspect where Thorn's damage dealt has a 45% chance to deal damage to all enemies around you, you can get this all the way up to 60% if you put it on an amulet. Means every time an enemy hits you, they're dealing that damage not only to them, but to everything around you as well. It is absolutely insane to watch one monster hit you and then explode everything else around you. This really has probably been my most favorite addition to Barbarian so far. But before we get into the rest of the equipment, let's get into the expertises that we're using. I've gone back to using the two-handed mace expertise, which has a 10% chance to gain 2 Fury when hitting an enemy, or 4 Fury when we are berserking. And this is because I really hate running out of Fury. But if you're not being Fury starved at all, then the other technique that I recommend equipping is the two-handed sword expertise, which is 20% of direct damage you deal is inflicted as bleeding damage over 5 seconds. Now we are dual wielding one-handed swords, which means we have a 20% chance to gain 5 Fury when hitting a crowd control enemy, and we're always going to be crowd controlling. And it's 20% because you get double the 10% chance when we're using 2 swords. And then killing a crowd control enemy grants 15% increased attack speed for 3 seconds, double this amount when using 2 swords. Now, if you wanted to, you could go for 1 sword and 1 one-handed mace as well, so that way you can get increased damage to stun. You can change this build up so many different ways to cater it to your own playstyle. But let's go over the armor and legendary aspects that we're using. For our headpiece, I wanted to make sure to prioritize cooldown reduction on this, as well as stats. I would have liked to get strength on this if I could. I also really wanted total armor. I've been trying to increase my armor as much as possible and my maximum life because it just makes you so much more survivable. So I wanted to make sure to prioritize cooldown reduction and survivability on my helmet. Obviously, we're going to be using Razorplate. It sucks losing all of the damage reduction that you can get from a typical chest piece, but this really ties the entire build that we're going for together. For my gauntlets, I prioritized 4 ranks ranks of Whirlwind. If you're doing Hoda or whatever you're doing, you would prioritize whatever your main core skill is here. I also wanted to make sure I got critical strike chance on here because it's very important. I still think I could get better gloves than these. These are by no way min-maxed yet. Temerity is another piece of equipment that really makes Barbarian and really any class far more survivable. I got a great roll on this, which means it gives us a barrier up to 72% of our maximum life anytime we heal ourselves beyond 100%. This is a lifesaver, and we have this because we're also tying it in with the thing that we put on our two-handed weapon, which is deal 50% increased damage while you have a barrier active. And since we have a barrier active all the time, we're dealing 50% damage all the time. It's fantastic. And then on my boots, I decided to finally just get rid of the Whirlwind periodically pulls enemies close to you. I felt like it wasn't ever proccing in time now that we're doing much more damage, and it felt like it was just a wasted legendary aspect. For a long time, I thought it was absolutely amazing, but I've decided now to put damaging a core enemy with a skill has a 36% chance to extend the duration of berserking by 1 second. Now, for my two-handed weapons, what I've prioritized is vulnerability damage and critical strike damage, and then strength. I really can't stress this enough that strength is such a good stat to make sure to have because it gives you increased damage percent as well as increased armor. I also really like having all stats on there because not only do we get more strength, but we get more dexterity, which is going to increase our crit chance, and it's going to get more willpower to help us unlock stuff in our Paragon board. If you don't go for all stats, I would go for core damage over all stats pretty much any time I could, but I just didn't get the roll that I wanted on this weapon. Now, we are dual wielding one-handed swords for this Whirlwind build. Because of the intrinsic stat on here of increased critical strike damage, I've also prioritized higher item power to make sure to maximize our damage per hit. So I don't have perfect rolls on these. I did prioritize strength on both of these again, as well as critical strike damage and vulnerability. Unfortunately, I didn't get vulnerability on either of these. I would have taken that over damage to slow or damage to crowd control if possible, and I probably still will replace the critical strike damage on this one for vulnerability, because if we go into our stats, you can see that I have significantly lower vulnerability damage than critical strike damage at the moment, and I believe that there is a diminishing return on the critical strike damage, and you really want to try and make sure that your vulnerability damage and critical strike damage are as close together as possible. You don't want to favor one too much more than the other, but I would definitely favor vulnerability damage over critical strike damage if you can. I just haven't gotten the best rolls lately. Now, on one of our weapons, we have attacking enemies with a basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 9% up to 30%. So essentially, I'm trying to hit something 3 times before I enter my Whirlwind. And then each point of fury you generate while at maximum fury grants your next core skill 2% increased damage up to 23%. So basically, we can do both of these at the same time. We're attacking with a basic skill. Once you hit max fury, hit a couple more times. Make sure to max this out, which is going to max this out, and then you enter your Whirlwind. Now, on our second two-hand weapon, we have critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, 150 strength, and 66 all stats. And then we also have Whirlwind's critical strike chances increased by 14% for each second it's channeled, up to 42%. We've already gone over the amulet that we're using. I have an extra 3 ranks of No Mercy on here, which increases our critical strike chance. I really like this stat. Also have cooldown reduction. Aside from these 2 stats, I would make sure that the other 2 stats that we get on here are actually damage reduction ones. Right now I have crowd control and defensive skills, but if you can get an amulet with cooldown reduction and damage reduction on there, definitely go for that. On our rings, I have whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 1.9 seconds for a nearby enemy up to 6 seconds. I prioritize maximum life, critical strike damage, and vulnerable damage on here. Also got damage to close enemies, which is nice. I don't see myself replacing this ring for a very long time. Now, the other ring that we're using, right now I have you gain 4 fury per second while berserking. We do enter berserking a lot with this build, but the other one I would recommend is the one that generates fury whenever your shouts are active. I just haven't gotten another one of those imprints in a while. I've also gone for vulnerable critical strike damage on here. We got damage to close and crowd control. I would have liked to have more life on these rings as well. Another item you could use here is Gore's Devastating Grips. Whirlwind explodes after it ends, dealing 25% of the total base damage dealt to surrounding enemies as fire damage. This can deal massive amounts of damage into the millions. I've been interchanging both of these, and Gore's Devastating Grips are probably better than the 19% increased skill damage, but I have 11% critical strike chance on here, and I felt that was important since we're so heavily invested into critical strike damage at the moment. Our skills are pretty straightforward. We have 1 point into Lunging Strike, Enhanced Lunging Strike, and then Combat Lunging Strike to try and get into Berserking. Then I have 5 points into Whirlwind with an additional 4 from our gloves. And then 1 point into Enhanced Whirlwind and Furious Whirlwind, which also inflicts 40% of its base damage as bleeding over 5 seconds. We have a lot of things in our Paragon tree that proc off of bleeding things dying or dealing damage to bleeding things, so this is pretty important, although not super necessary. You could instead go for Violent Whirlwind, and I've been testing going in between 2 of these. Right now, I still like Furious Whirlwind more. Then we have 3 points into Pressure Point for a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. Then 3 points into Imposing Presence for an additional 15% life. 1 into Rallying Cry, Enhanced Rallying Cry, and Tactical Rallying Cry. Now I have just 1 point into Outburst because I wanted to get 3 points into Tough as Nails, so we increase our thorns by 9% when enemies hit you, and they also take an additional 10% of our thorns as bleeding damage over 5 seconds. So in theory, this should apply bleeding to all the enemies, so you don't need the Furious Whirlwind, but I still like having it. Then I have 1 point into Challenging Shout with extras from my equipment, then Enhanced Challenging Shout and Tactical Challenging Shout. We have War Cry, Enhanced War Cry, and Power War Cry for an additional 10% damage. Then we have 3 points into Booming Voice, Raid Leader, and Guttural Yell, because that damage reduction is pretty important. I have 3 points into Swiftness because I feel super slow. Could take these points out of Swiftness and put them into Aggressive Resistance if you find yourself being a little too squishy. We then have 3 points into Pit Fighter and 3 ranks in No Mercy, but an additional 3, which means we now have 18% increased critical strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. And since we have 1 point into Hamstring, we're always going to have our enemies slowed because we're always applying bleeding to them. This also counts as a crowd control, so this bonus can come in so many different ways. We then have 1 point into Tempered Fury and 3 points into Invigorating Fury, then Wrath of the Berserker, Prime Wrath of the Berserker, and Supreme Wrath of the Berserker, and then we are going into Unbridled Rage. Now, if you don't have all of the stuff to make sure that you're not Fury starved, I would recommend going into Unconstrained instead until you can have enough Fury to make sure that you can use Unbridled Rage all the time. Now, my Paragon board, I've been doing a lot of messing around with, and it's by no way min-maxed at the moment. I will go over the glyphs that I'm using, but the placement of the glyphs will probably change over time, and we'll also go over the boards that we're using. The first glyph I have in here is the Exploit glyph, which gives us increased vulnerability damage, and also when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. It can't happen more than every 20 seconds, but entering combat with an enemy and they're already vulnerable is going to help a lot. We've then gone down the raw power thing here for an extra 20% physical damage and more strength. And then the other glyph I'm using right now is Seething, so we get 53.2% more damage with swords, and while wielding a sword, you gain 3 fury when you kill an enemy. This really helps with our damage and the amount of fury that we get, and as you level this one up, it'll become even more powerful. What I'll probably end up doing is taking Seething and putting it down here at the bottom, and then taking Exploit and putting it up where I have Seething at the moment, because there should be more dexterity up here that I can take advantage of. Now, the board I'm using here is the Blood Rage one, where killing an enemy has a 10% chance to grant Berserking for 5 seconds. There's also a lot of other bonus damage to bleeding enemies, as well as damage reduction from bleeding enemies, so this board I think is really good. You can also get increased damage while Berserking. And then for my third glyph at the moment, I'm using Disembowel. So we get increased physical damage over time, but the important thing about this is killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. We basically want to maintain our shouts as much as possible, so having this is pretty key. The board we're using here is the Flawless Technique one, which is for one-handed weapons. I don't know if I'm going to go for the Flawless Technique up here, but there is a lot of increased damage to have here from critical strike damage, as well as critical strike damage with one-handed weapons. Since we're dual-wielding swords, this is really nice. And then we also have damage reduction from close enemies, which is going to increase our survivability. At the top here, we also have 20% damage with one-handed weapons. I do have 2 other glyphs that I think are really great that I've been messing around with and leveling up. One of them is Wrath, which increases your critical strike damage by 5.6% at the moment for each 5 points of dexterity, but also skills that critically strike generate 3 fury. This one can be really good. I just have to find a great place for it. There's another one that can become very powerful, which is Imbiber. Since we have a barrier and we're going to be at full health all the time, what happens is with every 5 willpower we purchase within range, we deal an extra 7% increased damage while healthy. That's bananas. We also gain 30% increased potion healing. So I got to figure out which ones I'm going to swap out for this. What I might end up doing is switching out Wrath with Seething once I can get enough critical strike chance, so I'm critical striking all the time and generating fury all the time rather than just when something dies. And then my 4th glyph will be an Imbiber, and then I'll think that'll be perfect for my Paragon board.